Any intern can do your job, Aiden. You are just an unnecessary expense.
Okay, let's see how your intern will handle the $7.9 million you just lost.
Caleb didn't wait for anyone to sit before announcing it. Aiden Brooks is an unnecessary expense, he declared, voice sharp enough to slice through the air, effective immediately. He's terminated. The room didn't react, not at first. A few executives shifted in their chairs, exchanging the kind of uneasy glances people give when witnessing something obviously wrong, but choosing silence anyway. The tension didn't rise, it simply settled, heavy and unmoving, like everyone was afraid to breathe too loudly. For a moment, I felt the jolt brief, clean, almost clinical. Bang Huang, yes, but shock doesn't last long when you've survived enough boardroom storms to recognize a child lighting matches in a room full of gasoline. I kept my posture still, my hands steady, and let the words fall without answering, internally. I allowed myself a single dry thought. Funny how the people who understand the least are always the loudest. I'd spent 15 years managing the $7.9 million escrow budget tied to our largest international client. Not glamorous work, not public work, but critical, regulated, and deeply unforgiving if mishandled. My signature wasn't decoration. It was the legal backbone of the project. Caleb, on the other hand, had been CFO for 8 weeks and behaved like every cut he made was a personal audition for greatness. He wanted to prove he could trim the fat. Unfortunately for him, he had just mistaken an artery for fat. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't offer context. I simply let the room watch me absorb the blow with a calm that irritated Caleb far more than protest ever could. Because I knew something he didn't. They had just committed a mistake with consequences that weren't theoretical. As I turned to leave, the conference display blinked. A chime echoed across the table, soft but unmistakable. Custodian change detected, access revoked. Caleb's tablet went dark. Mine didn't. The executives leaned forward, confusion rippling through the room. Caleb tapped frantically, the color draining from his face as every financial console logged him out at once. I stepped into the hallway, letting a small, controlled smile surface. Their real problem hadn't even started yet. Take a slow breath with me, steady your shoulders, relax your jaw. Stories like this hit harder when your body isn't carrying tension, and while you're settling in. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? I'm always amazed how many places this community gathers from. Are you ready to follow this story all the way to the end, every turn, every twist, every moment they didn't see coming? If you are, tap subscribe so you don't miss a single part. Your support keeps these stories alive. Now hold on, because what happened next pushed the entire company into a freefall. HR escorted me into a smaller conference room as if I might bolt for the exit. The door clicked behind us, soft, controlled, rehearsed. You have 15 minutes to sign your separation documents, the HR manager said, sliding the stack across the table as though she were handing over a parking ticket. Her tone was polite, but her eyes were already elsewhere, already moving on. 15 years of service condensed into a quarter-hour countdown. The injustice of it hit me not loudly, but with a low, simmering heat that sat under my ribs. I felt the pressure rise, held it, and let it settle into something far more stable than anger, before I could pick up the pen. Caleb stepped into the doorway with a smirk he must have practiced in a mirror. Any intern could do your job, he said, tossing the sentence out like it cost him nothing. A soft laugh escaped me, not out of humor, but disbelief. The kind of laugh you get when someone proves they truly don't grasp the weight of what they've just broken. My colleagues lingered outside, pretending to check messages, avoiding my eyes. A few glanced down at the floor, their silence louder than any apology they might have offered. I looked at the termination papers, but what I saw in my mind was a different timeline, one made of long nights keeping our escrow system stable, double-checking discrepancies before they triggered international audits, fixing 2 near failures that would have cost the company millions. I'd carried responsibility no one else wanted, because I understood the consequences of neglect. Caleb, on the other hand, had once overseen a $1.2 million loss at his previous job, and somehow landed here anyway, padded by connections rather than competence. The contrast would have been funny if it weren't so predictable. The shock of the morning had faded, replaced by a strange, quiet clarity. Beneath the tightening knot of injustice, a thin thread of amusement unspooled. They had absolutely no idea what the mandatory audit trigger would do without a registered custodian in place. They believed they were cutting costs. In reality, they were cutting into a system held together by rules they had never bothered to understand. I signed one page, then another, taking my time. HR kept glancing at the clock. Caleb waited long enough to feel satisfied, then left, clearly believing the matter was closed. It wasn't. Somewhere down the hall, a chime echoed from the executive floor, bright, insistent, impossible to ignore. Moments later, phones vibrated, chairs scraped, and murmurs rose. The board had just received a message. Project Escrow halted, pending custodian verification. Confusion spread like a draft under a closed door. They whispered about system glitches. I capped the pen, stood, and allowed myself a small, private smile. "Oh," I murmured. "It's working exactly as designed." I walked out of the building with the same steady pace I used on ordinary Fridays. No rush, no anger, no need to look back. The cool air outside felt cleaner than the conference room ever had. And for a moment, it was almost peaceful. But peace rarely lasts long in a company that has no idea what it just detonated. By the time I reached the sidewalk, the first tremor had already hit their financial system. The freeze activated instantly, one crisp command buried deep in our infrastructure. Every dollar in the $7.9 million escrow account locked itself behind protocol within seconds. The system escalated the situation to a level 3 risk alert, the kind that flashes red banners across every executive console. Then came the automatic message to the external auditor. A polite but urgent note informing them that the custodian responsible for the international project had unexpectedly changed. In audit language, that phrase is the equivalent of a fire alarm being yanked in a crowded theater. I didn't need to see the chaos to know how it unfolded. I could picture it perfectly: analysts staring at frozen screens, managers rebooting laptops out of desperation, and Caleb demanding answers no one could give him. He would check the budget dashboard first, then blink twice when the numbers refused to move. He would try overriding the controls, only to discover he lacked the clearance to touch a single cent, and then he'd ask the question that would hang over the room like smoke. Why is the $7.9 million locked? The beauty of the moment, if we're allowed to call it beauty, was that the answer had been documented for everyone to read. I wrote the proposal for the mandatory audit trigger myself last year. After noticing small irregularities in departmental spending, I'd argued that any change to the escrow custodian should launch a full review, especially since the funds came from an international partner. The board approved it. Compliance praised it. Caleb never bothered to read it. Amazing how no one reads policy updates unless they wrote them. The thought made me smile as I crossed the street. Hands in my pockets, the afternoon light settling gently on the pavement. Somewhere behind me, a dozen alarms were probably going off in synchronized misery. Then came the final ripple, a message from the foreign funding agency, sent to the entire executive board. I imagined the subject line appearing on their screens: calm, diplomatic, devastating. They wanted immediate verification of the authorized budget custodian. Until they received it, all transactions were suspended. No exceptions, no workarounds, no shortcuts for newly minted CFOs. And that was the moment, I'm sure, when the sweat finally broke across Caleb's forehead. The system he tried to shake off as unnecessary had just answered back quietly, precisely, and exactly as intended. Smart viewers will stay for this part because it changes the whole story by the time I reached my car. The quiet on my side of the world stood in perfect contrast to the panic erupting on the executive floor. That was always the divide between people who built systems and people who merely inherited authority. One group understood how things worked. The other assumed everything would continue working no matter how recklessly they pulled at the threads. So while they scrambled, I simply unlocked my door, sat down, and let the engine idle with the ease of someone who knew the soundtrack of chaos would only get louder. Inside the boardroom, the scramble became a full collapse. I learned later that every attempt to initiate transactions bounced back with a red notice: escrow access suspended, custodian verification required. Not a single payment, approval, or scheduled release could move. The pipeline was frozen from top to bottom, and the executives were faced with a truth they had never considered: that projects depending on international escrow funding do not tolerate improvisation. Caleb stood at the front of the room insisting it was a system glitch. delivering the phrase with the confidence of someone who believed repetition could turn fiction into fact. But the room wasn't buying it. One of the senior directors, a man who had been with the company since before Caleb finished high school, rose from his seat with a slow, deliberate motion. A glitch, he asked. Aiden was the system. The words cut through whatever illusion of control Caleb thought he had left. Even he couldn't argue with a truth spoken that plainly, and right on cue. Another layer of trouble surfaced. The entire board received an email from our international client. Escrow holder has changed. Project is suspended until Aiden Brooks confirms. No anger, no blame. Just a simple statement of procedure, cold enough to silence the room. The boardroom shifted from confusion to dread. Caleb tried to maintain a neutral expression, but the tremor in his hand gave him away. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the conference table, hoping stability would follow. It didn't. Every person in that room understood that an international partner requesting verification wasn't an inconvenience, it was a red flag signaling imminent collapse. Meanwhile, my phone vibrated once, a single notification lighting the screen. A senior director, the same one who defended my work more than once in quieter days, was calling. I let it ring for a moment before answering, more out of courtesy than curiosity. Aiden, he said carefully. Can we talk? I could hear the tension, the humility that arrives only after someone realizes the person they dismissed holds the key to their survival. His voice was steady, but the desperation underneath was undeniable. For a heartbeat. I considered softening, but then I remembered the conference room, the termination papers, Caleb's grin. I'm no longer unnecessary, I replied, keeping my tone calm. Remember, I ended the call, set the phone aside, and let the quiet fill the car again. Quiet that, for the first time all day, belonged entirely to me. You will want to stay until the end to hear this part. The next morning arrived with a quiet so sharp it felt like a clean line drawn between who I had been at the company and who I was now. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and let the calm settle into my breathing. If chaos was unfolding on their side, it wasn't my responsibility to absorb it anymore. But I knew the next phase of the fallout would come quickly, and it did, starting with an alert from the compliance division. Their message thread unfolded like a slow confession. Overnight. They had sifted through every authorization record tied to the escrow account. It didn't take them long to hit the wall I knew was waiting for them. My name was the only one registered with the international client. Not one of several. Not primary with a backup. I was the designated custodian, the official signatory, and the holder of the financial liability bond that backed the entire $7.9 million fund. The bond itself was legally binding. A personal guarantee of accuracy and integrity. It carried weight, real, regulatory weight. Caleb's name, however, appeared nowhere, not on the authorization list, not on the liability bond, not on the backup permissions. He had as much right to touch the escrow account as the receptionist downstairs, which is why the system had locked him out before it locked out anyone else. Compliance spelled it out bluntly. Unauthorized personnel attempted to access restricted escrow funds in corporate language. That was one step away from labeling him a financial risk. As the review deepened, the board's understanding shifted from confusion to something colder, fear disguised as realization. They hadn't just fired a mid-level budget custodian. They'd severed the only legally recognized link to the international fund, keeping their largest initiative alive. And the moment they removed me, the project became structurally unsalvageable unless I reinstated my own authority, which, ironically, I had no obligation to do. I leaned back in my chair, scrolling through the documents the client had sent months earlier, the updated custodian requirements, the step-by-step protocol for verification, the clause that clearly stated the project could be withdrawn if the authorized custodian did not confirm any personnel change. My signature was stamped at the bottom. Theirs wasn't. And all it would take for the entire operation to collapse was silence. My silence. A small, humorless laugh slipped out. Suddenly, my 15 years of expertise became irreplaceable. Fascinating timing. The words tasted sharper than I expected, but they fit the moment perfectly. Then a new notification appeared on my screen. This one marked with higher urgency. It was from compliance again, forwarded to the entire executive team, and, apparently, me as well. Someone must have forgotten to remove my email from the distribution list. We need Aiden present Monday morning. No explanation, no request, just necessity. Delivered with the precision of a verdict. Monday carried a different weight, not the dread of someone returning to a former employer, but the deliberate calm of someone walking into a battlefield already mapped out in his mind. I arrived early, not out of courtesy, but strategy. I wanted to see the room before they saw me. I wanted the silence to settle in my favor. The receptionist did a double take when I walked past, but she said nothing. Power, when quiet, is rarely questioned. When I reached the executive conference room, the door was half open, revealing Caleb inside, pacing like a man rehearsing confidence he didn't possess. He kept glancing at the screen displaying the frozen Escrow dashboard, jaw tightening each time the red suspended banner blinked. As I stepped forward, he stopped mid-stride, relief washing over his face with embarrassing transparency. "Aiden," he said, exhaling. "Good, you're here. We just need you to fix this." And I held up a hand not rudely, just enough to press pause on his assumptions. "I'm not here in the capacity you think." His brows pulled together, confusion replacing relief. The room quieted as the board members filed in, each taking their seats with the grave attention of people preparing for unpleasant truths. When the last chair settled, I stepped fully into the room and placed my credentials on the table. "I'm attending today," I said evenly, "as the escrow representative for our client." The silence that followed was the kind that bends time. A few executives blinked, one inhaled too sharply. Caleb's expression collapsed into something raw, a mixture of disbelief and dread. He looked at the badge again, as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something less catastrophic. I didn't sit immediately. Instead, I opened my briefcase and removed a slim folder, nothing dramatic, nothing thick, just a clean, precise report. I laid it on the table, the soft thud loud enough in the quiet. "This," I said, "is a summary of the discrepancies the client asked me to review." Caleb went pale. He recognized the format. He recognized the implications. These weren't catastrophic errors, at least, not individually. Small violations, overlooked approvals, minor breaches of protocol, but together. They formed exactly the kind of pattern international partners viewed as instability. If the client saw this, the project wouldn't merely be paused, it would be terminated. "I trust," I continued, voice calm, "that the board understands the obligation to disclose these findings to the funding partner." Caleb shook his head slightly, a silent plea forming behind his eyes. He wanted me to protect him, to shield the company, to pretend the problems were solvable. But strategy is rarely sentimental. I slid the report to the center of the table and gave the smallest, coldest smile I'd allowed myself in years. Let the client decide. The room didn't erupt all at once. It folded inward slowly, like everyone had just realized they were standing on a floor that might give way beneath them. I remained seated, hands loosely clasped, the report resting in front of me like a quiet blade. When the board asked for clarification, I answered with the same measured tone I'd used for years, the tone they once found boring, predictable until predictability became the only stability they had left. "Let me summarize," I said. Turning a single page, Caleb initiated unauthorized staffing cuts in a department bound by escrow compliance. A few heads snapped toward him, his jaw tightened. He also disrupted the escrow workflow by bypassing the verification chain. More murmurs. And finally, he attempted to reassign the custodian role without client approval. That alone constitutes a breach of the international funding agreement. Each item landed like a stone, dropped into deep water, no splash. Just wait. Caleb tried to speak, but the chairman lifted a hand, silencing him with a gesture that carried decades of authority. Before the board could respond, the speakerphone on the table blinked. A representative from our international client was already on the line for the scheduled review. The chairman cleared his throat and invited them to speak. What followed was not a discussion. It was a verdict delivered in a voice so calm it chilled the room. "We are withdrawing the $7.9 million immediately." Silence collapsed over everything. Papers froze mid-air. Someone whispered a curse. Caleb's face drained to a color that didn't belong to a living person. He opened his mouth, then closed it, then tried again. But no explanation could outrun the truth sitting in front of him. Without the escrow funds, the company wasn't just inconvenienced, it was crippled. Entire departments depended on that budget cycle. Vendor payments, research milestones, compliance obligations, all of it evaporated with one sentence. The board didn't look shocked, they looked betrayed. Their eyes moved from the blinking speakerphone to the man responsible, and the shift was unmistakable. They no longer saw a CFO, they saw liability. Caleb tried to defend himself. This is a misunderstanding and overreaction. Aiden is exaggerating. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The documents, the locks, the halted workflow. Everything he dismissed as unnecessary had stepped forward to testify without my encouragement. I simply tightened my fingers together, resting my hands lightly in my lap, projecting a calm that made his panic feel even louder. One director leaned back, exhaling sharply. Another shook his head in disbelief. The chairman rubbed his temple like he was absorbing 10 years of stress in 10 seconds. Caleb's downfall wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, inevitable, like a structure collapsing under its own neglected foundation. And I just sat there, hands intertwined, watching the fear spread through the room exactly as it was earned. The tension in the room didn't ease after the client disconnected, it thickened, pulling tight around every person seated at the table. Fear had settled like dust after an explosion, and in the middle of it sat Caleb, trying desperately to gather the pieces of authority that had already slipped through his fingers. His eyes darted from director to director, searching for an ally, a saving hand, anything, but all he found were hardened stares and folded arms. I remained quiet, watching him from across the table. My calm didn't just unsettle him, it cornered him. Silence, when chosen, has a way of exposing the truth more brutally than shouting ever could. Finally, he turned toward me, voice cracking under the weight of everything collapsing around him. Aiden, look, we're all under pressure here. Just please help us fix this. The irony nearly coaxed a laugh out of me, but I kept my composure. My voice came out smooth, steady, unmistakably cold. You said an intern could do my job, I reminded him. Let them fix this. The words hit harder than any raised voice could have. A few board members inhaled sharply. One looked down, almost embarrassed on Caleb's behalf. But the majority watched me with a clarity that said they finally understood the imbalance they had allowed to grow unchecked, where competence was undervalued and arrogance was rewarded. Caleb's face twisted, hope draining out of him. Aiden. I didn't mean, but he never finished the sentence. The chairman rose from his seat, shoulders heavy with resignation. We've reached our conclusion, he announced. His voice carried the weight of consequence final. Irreversible. Effective immediately. Caleb Mercer is suspended from his role as CFO pending a full internal investigation. Caleb froze, then collapsed backward into his chair as if the structure beneath him had given way. His eyes glossed red, blinking rapidly, struggling to process the reality settling around him. He wasn't just being reprimanded, he was being removed publicly, decisively, unmistakably. No one moved to comfort him, no one even looked surprised. Justice wasn't loud, it was sharp, clean, and in this room, long overdue. I rose slowly, not out of ceremony but intention. The energy-shifted eyes followed me, not like a fired employee, but like someone whose presence held the leverage the entire company now depended on. I gathered my folder, slid my badge into my pocket, and adjusted my coat. There was no triumph in my expression, only certainty. The chairman nodded toward me, not as a superior, but as a man acknowledging someone he should never have underestimated. Caleb kept his head lowered, shoulders trembling. I walked toward the door with the unhurried confidence of a guest who had been treated with unexpected courtesy, and as it closed behind me, the thought settled cleanly. Some consequences arrive quietly, but when they do, they change everything. The days that followed carried a strange calm, the kind that arrives only after a storm has finished tearing through everything it meant to tear through. I woke earlier than usual, not out of anxiety, but because silence felt like a luxury I could finally afford. The company's chaos no longer belonged to me. It hummed somewhere far away, like distant sirens in a city I'd already moved out of. I brewed my coffee, stepped outside, and let the morning settle around me with a softness I hadn't felt in years. By midweek, the fallout became public. The International Funding Agency issued a formal notice they were launching a full investigation into the company's misuse of escrow protocols. The tone of the announcement was polite, almost sterile, but the implications were lethal. They demanded the immediate return of the escrow funds, which the company, already strained, could barely manage. The main contract was suspended indefinitely. Compliance officers and auditors flooded the building like a small army armed with clipboards and quiet judgment. Employees began whispering in corridors, in parking lots, in group chats they believed management couldn't access. Stories have a way of finding their true shape once pressure exposes the cracks. Everyone knew who triggered the collapse, and everyone knew who had tried to warn them in his own restrained, consistent, overlooked way. I didn't revel in the finger-pointing, but I couldn't deny the symmetry of it all. The CEO called me 3 times over 2 days. His messages grew shorter, the tone shifting from professional to pleading. I let each call ring until it stopped. There was nothing left for me to say, and nothing he could offer that would rewrite the arrogance that led them here. Some lessons I've learned only settle in when the silence on the other end of the phone becomes impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, my life slipped into a comfortable rhythm. I took long walks through the neighborhood, appreciating how ordinary everything looked when your responsibilities no longer extended to holding up a system built on shaky foundations. I stopped by the corner cafe, ordered the same drink I used to rush through, and actually tasted it for once. The world moved more slowly, as if giving me time to inhale properly after years of holding my breath. There was a quiet humor in the way events unfolded, a soft, amused recognition that the company had dismissed me for being unnecessary, only to discover how deeply necessary stability becomes when those in power mistake confidence for competence. My voice might have been absent in their crisis, but the consequences spoke fluently in my place, and as I sipped my coffee, I felt the gentle, unmistakable peace of someone who had finally stepped out from under a burden that was never his to carry alone. Freedom arrived quietly, no announcement, no ceremony. Just the slow realization that my days no longer revolved around problems I didn't create or crises I was expected to patch without acknowledgement. The sunlight felt different in the mornings, warmer somehow, as if the world had finally unclenched around me. I took my time, rising, made my coffee without rushing, and stepped onto the balcony with the steady calm of someone who no longer owed his energy to people who mistook loyalty for obligation. The news about the company spread quickly in industry circles. Losing the escrow funds had been devastating enough, but the suspended contract cost them more than $40 million in projected revenue. Their stock dipped, their investors demanded explanations, and, unsurprisingly, Caleb's suspension pending investigation became a permanent termination when the board realized how costly his ego had been, even from a distance. I could almost hear the thud of that final decision landing. A week after the fallout, I received a call not from my former employer, but from the international client whose project had sparked the entire collapse. The representative's voice carried a clarity I remembered from every document they'd ever sent direct. Measured. No wasted breath. "Aiden," she said, "we want you to oversee all escrow and financial operations for our North American initiatives. Senior financial advisor, full authority. Compensation will reflect your expertise." For a moment, I didn't speak, not out of disbelief, but because the simplicity of the offer carried more validation than any apology my old company could have fabricated. I accepted, not with excitement, but with a grounded sense of alignment, as though a door I'd been trying not to notice had finally opened wide enough for me to step through. The work was challenging, complex, global, exactly the kind of responsibility I'd been managing quietly for years, except now the recognition matched the effort. And, perhaps more importantly, the people I worked with valued competence over theatrics. It felt like breathing with both lungs again. Sometimes, while reviewing a new funding structure or running simulations for upcoming partnerships. I caught myself thinking back to the boardroom, to Caleb's words, to the smirk he wore when he called me unnecessary. There was no resentment left in the memory, only a strange kind of clarity. "They called me unnecessary," I said one morning as I closed my laptop, the city humming softly outside. Turns out, unnecessary was the only thing holding them together. The irony didn't sting, it settled comfortably, like truth finally taking its rightful place. And before this chapter closes, let me speak directly to you, the one listening, watching, or reading right now. Where are you joining this story from? Have you ever been underestimated, overlooked, or dismissed by someone who barely understood the work you held together with your own hands? If any part of this journey resonates with you, tell me in the comments. I read everyone. And if you want to follow more stories like this, stories of quiet resilience, sharp justice, and earned rebirth, make sure to subscribe. Your presence here matters more than you know.